Good morning, everybody. Today's date, I believe, is November 7th. It's a Tuesday. I'm Tom Kaczynski, and decided to come on to chat this morning. Had a little time. Just some ideas I'm thinking about. You guys all enjoy listening, and I want to say first, it's good to hear from you all. The people who just like to hear me and the people who just like to disagree with me. I don't know why you listen to it, but I guess maybe at least it's intelligent commentary. But glad to have you all nonetheless. And for anyone who wants to support the program, I still have the Venmo up at CVCPRV. But I know everyone's going through tough times. Lord knows we are as well. I'm actually sitting here right in front of my wood stove just watching the fire catch a little bit. So you might see me take a small 10-second break at some point in this. But it's snowing outside up here in Maine, and it's a cold winter, and the cold days are ahead. So let's talk about what's happening a little bit out there in the world. One thing that I saw that I think is worth mentioning, that in response to Russia doing the same, the U.S. and NATO, all these countries have withdrawn from the limits on conventional forces in Europe's treaty, which basically means they're building big armies that are going to be on that plane again. And whether you think it's going to lead to war or not, it's up to you to decide. But ultimately, this is one of the first steps you would expect to be along the way. And it's interesting because this is happening at the same time that Ukraine is basically being told, yeah, you're SOL, you better try to sue for peace on terms. And they could have had very good terms years ago, but they listened to Washington, they listened to the neocons, and listening to the neocons will get you in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to leave aside. I do have thoughts on what happened in Nashville. We'll leave that aside, other than to say I think it's really interesting, the ideas that were not shared and that they deliberately suppressed that. That's not surprising. Mental illness happens, and look, violence is permitted in one direction only. If you look and sound something like me, the government treats you as a horrible threat and watches everything you do. Whereas if you look or act the opposite, the government will basically give you free money to do whatever you want. And one has to conclude that there is a hostile element in charge of our governments that wants to see the destruction of the core folk, of the people at the heart of the U.S. And an interesting thing, you guys always like when I drop names. I found a new philosopher that I'm going to take a look at. His name is Johann Herder. There's no reason you should have heard of him, but he was one of the earliest, as far as I can tell, perhaps the earliest wokish philosopher who literally stood in opposition to Kant on the idea that cultures create nations that have their unique identities that are transcend just the idea of an individual. And as you think about what you're a part of in the future, I think there's an idea there that's really worth pulling forward. This catches fire faster than I thought. But that's okay. It's going to be nice and toasty in here, and I like that. I'm getting to the point where I'm old enough that, thinking about winter doesn't exactly bring me joy. So we were talking about Ukraine for a second there, and NATO, and the impending war, the sides that are forming in this. And, one of the things that's interesting to read and watch is the shock from the people who run the media that they are not supported by the very golems they've created. And they made the decision years ago to kneecap who they saw as their biggest threat by bringing in a bunch of people who are relatively low agency, who serve the purpose only to divide and conquer, and that now run a lot of the political discourse, or at least the social discourse. They control the streets, as they say, in these countries. I think a particularly instructive example is Britain, where they're looking desperately to criminalize the many Muslims who are marching through their streets, angry, rightfully so, about what's being done to Gaza. And, it's interesting. I've been trying to understand better Gaza and that backstory, and it's a mess. I mean, Gaza, Hamas was a form of Sunni radicalism that, if you believe Ron Paul, Rick Wiles, and a whole bunch of other people who are generally credible on these things, was created with the help and assistance of the Israelis, perhaps with some of their allies in Egypt, as a escape valve for a problem to them both, because the Muslim Brotherhood was a problem going all the way back to Nasser, and before that in Egypt, which is why Egypt swears they're not going to take them, despite the fact that there's probably a support in the street for them amongst their own poor people. One of the things that's interesting about the Islamic world, and has been a feature of it, by the way, for at least the last 100 years, since the British kind of left the mess that they did out of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Turks, I should say, is that you have leaders in countries that are arbitrarily drawn, a street that has an identity that's far beyond that, but yet lives in poverty, and they're held under strict suppression, whether that's a secular militarism like Egypt has, or, you know, the Wahhabi deal that was made with the Bedouin chiefs that led to Ibn al-Saud to work with, Wahb in the first place. I've learned the background of this, read a lovely book, 2009, by I'm so bad at Arab names, Tamim Ansari, that was called Destiny Disrupted, which, if you want a 300-page read that will give you a good background of the Islamic world, kind of the last couple thousand years, or at least since the interactions of how their civilization is different with the West, it's worth it. And the one thing you begin to realize is the nation state is primarily a Western phenomenon. The states that exist in the Middle East are phenomenons that come out of Western colonialism. The idea that Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Arabia are transcendent states has no background in history. And in that region, you know, like the sands of the hourglass, these are the day of our lives. Things shift around pretty quick over there. Like Syria was part of Egypt for a little bit up until, you know, the failure in the 67 war, really where America got in there, because the question was, you know, they tried to nationalize the Suez Canal, and the American foreign policy structure, you know, looked at this as a question, going back to Eisenhower, about whether or not they would stand against the Soviet Union, because Americans are caught up in ideological wars to the point of destroying our own civilization. We all understand that, we live that, but it's destroying the entire West right about now, and one side has to win. And you'd have to think that if the left side wins, they will have a self-destructive philosophy, and the right side doesn't seem to have leadership. I mean, you look at Trump, you know, coming forward, he's just going to represent a Zionist hack, and it's obvious. I mean, I know some people like him. I don't really know why at this point. I mean, his own track record speaks against him, but you probably think the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and sometimes the enemy of your enemy is still your enemy, and you need to be aware of that. But back to the Middle East and, you know, all these things that are happening over there. The thing you need to be aware of is that in the same way that many of us would love to have a different governing structure, the Arab world is very susceptible to that. Jordan is susceptible to that. Lebanon's susceptible to that. Syria is susceptible to that. Iraq is already sort of experiencing that. Iran was reformulated on that basis. Tunisia, Egypt went through it the last few years. So any of these countries, all of these countries could reform. And you have to understand, too, the larger Muslim view of this. And I say this without any sort of criticism, but Islam kind of looks at the last couple hundred years, as best I can tell, something like this. And this may or may not be accurate, but they were the center of the world. The uppity, shaggy folk came from the outside, started imposing things through trade and economy that they either found offensive or tried to keep up with. Ultimately, when they tried to play games with us and play ball, we screwed them every time they did. Think of Mossadegh in Iraq or in Iran, the 1953 CIA coup, the various things that were done against Nasser, even Assad. Hussein was a client state of the U.S. I mean, Rumsfeld went over there. You guys know this is relatively recent history. And so they see the way we go in there, and they see their own efficacy, you know, because in the Islamic world, and you have to understand the sort of cultural, religious significance of how they think of things. If you go back far enough, the Prophet's success as a militaristic movement, and keep in mind, when we think of religion in the West, we think of it as a personal choice. They look at it as a communal political exercise. Okay, it's structured so differently. It would take hours to explain it all, and it's worth understanding. But the bottom line is, they look like if they just come together and are true to how they can be to one another, they can remove people. And they see this as part of a larger narrative, that the Mujahideen were able to expel the mighty Soviets from, Afghanistan, and then the Americans thereafter. And that ultimately that we in the West have no staying power. And that's true, because our imperial actions are usually for a form of sort of economic colonialism, where we don't see things the way they do. Give me 1 second here. Just have to close the stove door. You can hear that going in there, because I don't want to burn myself here. All right. So you begin to understand that from their perspective, they feel like they're winning the long war. And I don't mean this in terms of the states who are in bed with the West, as is always the case, because elites always want to make money and they work with one another because they fear their own people. And why wouldn't they? That's why they're trying to control mass communications. It's interesting, going back to the Nashville thing, for instance, how Google, this platform, would be censoring it entirely, or same as you see on Facebook or Reddit or anywhere but X. And I think it's interesting that everyone's being herded onto Twitter or X. You know, they built their new thing to look just like a currency symbol, and I think that's no accident. But leave that for another day. Elon's serving some purpose. What it is will be pulled out in time. I'm always more suspicious that people who seem friendly than enemy. But back to the Islamic world for a little bit. As these pictures grow, as the anger builds, it may not be long before Arab states are toppled, or much like we've seen in other countries, leadership may come to the fore of someone who says, this government doesn't represent you, we're going to go in there, we're going to fight this. It could happen in Lebanon, it could happen in Jordan. Don't overlook Jordan. Jordan has a huge Palestinian population, and the only thing I think that's restrained this is that the issues have been in the West Bank. Every country that borders Gaza, Saudi Arabia doesn't want to see that resolved. They like having the prison camp. I mean, the leadership, not the people. The people are mad, of course. The Egyptians do not need more Muslim Brotherhood to destabilize their own country, where they basically are running a military dictatorship again, just like they did under, what was his name, Mubarak. Who was there before. And as far as Israel goes, Israel has a lot of different actions there. Some people think they want to build an alternative to the Suez Canal. I've seen it. It's interesting. I mean, it would be valuable, but I doubt Egypt would let that happen so easily. That would lead to yet another war, because that would be a different economic interest that would drive the Egyptians. Conversely, what we see is with all the propaganda coming out of there, and look, it's real. I mean, Israel is basically carpet bombing civilian areas where, to be honest, Hamas and the guerrillas are probably hiding, but ultimately you have to decide about the rules of war, and this is basically a campaign of pseudo-genocide, and it kind of has to be for them, because these people cannot live together. You could argue, rightly, I think, that, the Zionists probably should have never been put there, and then, if you want to believe in the Pike-Mazzini letter, maybe this was done as a problem waiting to be solved, because that's what you begin to understand, especially when you study British history. The Brits were really good at leaving problems in their wake, like Kashmir between India and Pakistan, Kuwait cut off from Iraq. You could pick other ones, Kenya, Tanzania, issues with Zimbabwe or Rhodesia at the time. You can go all over the world, or even the U.S. and Canada to some extent, that they had a separate thing right here in case things got too uppity. But we all ended up on the same page, and America ended up very wealthy, and they found other ways to control, or other actors were able to have a controlling interest, through finance. And some people see the world through finance. The West sees the world through finance because we're stuck in that paradigm. But the world is also shifting because the dollar is becoming worthless. And once people are so poor, it doesn't really matter that they have to follow the same old story. They could look at things differently. And for the Arab street, they're kind of at that point. And popular crusades can happen in weird times. I mean, the First Crusade in the West was much a similar time in a lot of ways. There was a time of some economic development in a world that was coming up, but people who didn't have a place. And so, Clement sent them out and said, hey, go conquer, in the name of the cross. And they did. Sometimes they were enemies, sometimes they were open areas, sometimes they were nominal allies. I mean, as much as you consider the Byzantines, that's a tricky situation, right? The Fourth Crusade. But in any case, there are forces here that are being unleashed that may very well prove to be beyond the control of the people who are unleashing them. And one wonders, is it incompetence, or is there some devious agenda behind it? And I think in the end, the elites want a lower population world where technology serves to mollify a less restive population that will be heavily reduced. But getting there is the tricky part, and having A remove B seems to be a big part of the equation. So we'll see if that works out the way they plan it. I don't think it will. I do think that the United States right now suffers from a terrible vacuum in leadership, and that it will be destructive to the whole society. I mean, we don't need to talk about the inflationary costs. This is going to be a very sad Christmas for everyone, and I'll tell you one of the big hints. I had worked in previous years doing some Christmas delivery type stuff, and I've looked at different things. No one's hiring for anything like that. And I only tell you this for one reason, because no one's buying anything, and how can anyone when the cost of energy, the cost of food goes up, and the public assistance has gone down markedly since since we're in the post-COVID era, because now the anger is supposed to be directed outwardly, so now austerity is being pushed on you. And part of this is the psychology of controlling whole societies. They want you desperate enough where you're looking for a way out, but when you're looking for a way out, you tend not to look upward so much. Usually revolutions actually happen at times when people are somewhat upwardly mobile, and what they've been very good about, and by this I mean sort of information police state is preventing the rise of any sort of meaningful alternative that would be a threat to them. There are different movements that are encouraged as outlets, like BLM. You saw the how corrupt it was, how these people were pocketing all that money, and that's perfectly fine. They're happy with that outcome because the disillusionment that results is part of the story. And you know, people now are back to the whole, you know, we're mad at them, they're mad at us paradigm. And so if everyone's fighting everyone, then the people on top are pretty happy, and that's how puppet mastery works. But in the United States, I think that we are running a serious danger of a systemic collapse. You look at who gets hired for things, how people are selected. I mean, I know AI is rushing to fill in the gaps, but what do you do when all the people are left and there's no purpose to them? And you're just hiring people for sinecures for money that's fake. Do they continue to trundle along? Are we going down the path of like Argentina did for many, many years? There's an argument to be made for that. And as much as I'm thinking of moving and getting out of there, one of the features I like about Argentina is that they have a totally underground economy because they have to, because their currency, the peso, is broken. And when the dollar breaks, what will Americans do? We are not used to a low standard of living, and you know, all this money that went into the military-industrial complex, all that money that went to Ukraine, supposedly, that went to companies like Raytheon and General Dynamics and, you know, all the big ones, Boeing, you know, your contractors who build those sort of missiles and build that. We can see things are moving quickly in that direction, but it's moving in a way where the people are being considered enemies on all sides. States are just fighting for control over a new global edifice. And where does it leave the rest of us? And I think we're just left alone. We're left to our own devices. I mean, that's why I'm sitting here in front of a wood stove, because I didn't trust the gas to keep coming. And it's a lot of work, and it's a pain. You guys like me to talk about homestead life, but I'll be honest, homestead life is exhausting. You know, look how much older I looked than I just did a few years ago. For some of you, you can find my old videos from 5 years ago. I'm an old man now. And that's okay. I mean, I still have ideas. I still talk to people. There are people who see the problem. There's a lot more people who see the problem, but there's a lot more people who understand what can you do about it, because all we have left is our entertainment and our communication, which is a surveillance net that serves to limit what we can do. And it's very hard to do things in person because you can't afford it and people aren't near one another. And even if you were, you can't get past the stupidity upon which people are standing. And, you know, when you're stuck counting, either waiting for the system to collapse or counting for your enemies to rescue you, that's a very difficult situation. It's too bad we don't have a time where we can celebrate things. So we do what we do in all dark ages. We celebrate the Lord. We go back to the fundamentals, and we accept that this is the punishment. And it is a punishment. Let's be honest about it. It's a punishment for a society that has withdrawn itself from virtue. It has indulged itself in idolatry. It has found the spirit of the divine feminine of licentiousness that ran through Babylon. And men have lost themselves, and women have lost themselves too. I'm not here to get into the depths of those ugly conversations. They're relevant, but what are you going to do? You need to build a new structure and a new foundation for yourself, and there's no leadership. You have to do this in a vacuum where your purchasing power goes down, your threats are going to get greater, and you know, in reality, I doubt anything good could happen. Because even if you wanted to fix the problem, let's say I put on my thinker cap and I played Ender for a minute, the amount of death it would require to right the ship in America is more than anyone can internally contemplate and be willing to do without a stain on their soul worth. You know, even considering. I mean, and people have looked at it. I was mentioning to a friend today, if you wanted a feel for it, Orson Scott Card, the guy who wrote the Ender books. If you want a real easy way, watch Ender's Game. But if you want something a little more complex, he wrote a couple books back in the mid-aughts, Empire and Hidden Empire, which I think are an interesting thought experiment of how, you know, if, let's say we had let's pretend we lived in the Q universe for a moment instead of the BS control mechanism that was. And there was a group of good men who could do hard things. Well, yeah, there are things that could be done. There is a way, like any other controlled demolition, to arrange things where certain outcomes would come out that would be at least would allow America to transition from the Republic period to the Imperial period, because it's either going to go that way. It's either going to go quick empire and collapse, or it's going to go stable empire and be militaristic, but it's going to have to revitalize a culture of that. And the culture that this country needs is not the culture its people are prepared to accept. So you would have to have the huge bloodletting that happens when these happen, and you don't usually see the right wing do that because of the respect they have of morality. The left wing would do that in a heartbeat. They're more than happy to throw you in camps, chasing their ideal of equality realized on Earth, so that somehow material progress can end suffering. It never works, though. That's not the purpose of the simulation. That's not what we're dealing with here on this planet. What we're dealing with is to learn the limits of it, and this is the wisdom of it. You can't change certain things, and to accept that all you can do is give your own testimony. And that's a good and godly way for Christians to think, to keep their sanity in this time, because you're going to tell people messages, they're not going to listen to you. After they don't listen to you, you're going to feel sad, you're going to feel upset, but you will have done your duty. And at this point, duty is what some of us have to fall back on: duty and piety, and a little bit of belief, and just otherwise just hold out as long as you can. And that's the best advice I can give you. There are other parts of the world who are not as spoiled as us, who may open up doors we can't see yet. I don't know what those are going to look like, but I do know that it's something we will have to watch together. So those are just some thoughts for this morning. I got to go out there and shovel snow before the rain comes in, because otherwise the snow becomes real heavy, and that's nasty. That's a pro tip for you if you ever live in a cold environment. Don't let the snow get heavy. Get it out of there when it's light, especially if you have weather that's going to bounce up and back. But we're going to have a cold winter in Maine. I can feel it, but God willing, it will be my last one. So, not that, it's actually interesting. I used to love snow, and now I've lost my love for a lot of different things, and that's why I'm quiet these days. I mean, I speak for the 10 or 12 of you who want to hear. I don't really promote this. I don't care to. I'm just, you wanted to hear from me, you wanted some thoughts, and you wanted a voice to keep you comfortable. So here I am, trying to help out and just doing the Lord's work. Dana tells me it's a ministry of sorts, so just know that you're not alone. We're in this together, and that ultimately this too shall pass. God bless each of you. Have a great day. I'm Tom Kaczynski, Venmo, CVC, PRV, and I will see you later this week. God bless.